The applause is very nice. Thank you very much. In all honesty, yeah, I did wear a uniform for a long time, but the privileges in serving. It's nice when people acknowledge that, but it was a privilege to serve. Not everybody gets to wear the uniform of their country. I see some friendly faces in here. President Haggerty, thank you very much for coming in. I'm kind of wondering, when do you sleep, sir? You're here most of the time. A number of years ago, I was working down in South Texas, and I was reading a reference that I had in my library, and I came across one paragraph in this monograph about the Buffalo Soldiers. And this paragraph was kind of confusing. It was, I felt at the time that it was mildly pejorative, and it just tweaked my interest. How many professional historians do I have in the room? Anybody? No? Anybody who majored in history? Oh, good. The question that I came across was reinforced a number of years ago when I was assigned in Washington, and I was continuing to work on this. I was in the National Archives, deeply immersed in something called Records Group 94. And I was trying to find the autopsies of two men that you'll learn about here in a couple of minutes. And in order to find that, I had to come up with the control number and some other things. So I'm looking in this ledger about like this, about like so thick. And it was the ledger of deaths in the United States Army for 1874 to 1876. Wasn't really alphabetical, wasn't by date, so I'm just kind of leafing through this thing trying to find it. And I finally came across the two guys I was looking for, but along the way, I kept coming across names of men, and in the columns out to the right, I kept coming across tick marks. Multiple tick marks for multiple men. And I'm thinking, what the heck is this? This doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I, got my two autopsies, went on back, started looking at these tick marks. And what it was the names of the individual soldiers who had died with Custer at the Little Bighorn. And suddenly, it quit being just a history research question. Suddenly, it became very real because I was working with people rather than just data points. So what we're going to talk about tonight is an incident that is, as a friend of mine and I were talking about a little earlier, this is really obscure. I mean, if you're asked this question in a trivia contest and you know their answer, you just hit it over the center field wall, trust me, because nobody's going to know about this, and I'm surprised you're here. But first thing I'd like to get out is the insignia for the 9th Cavalry. It's pronounced cavalry, folks. C-A-V-A-L-R-Y. It is not Calvary. Calvary is a hill just outside Jerusalem, where a guy named Jesus, who, whether you believe any of the religious connotations around him or not, died on a cross by the Romans. So, 9th Cavalry. The illustration that you see there to the right, complete disclosure, is one by Frederick Remington, of a private in the 10th Cavalry. There's nothing by him that relates to the 9th. But this gives you a real good idea of the enlisted man in the cavalry regiments. And let's talk for a couple of minutes about what this is. What we're talking about is an incident that took place at Grulla, Texas. It is an incident that Gallantry was a part of it, but also there's angst, there is tragedy, there's death, there is what's the word I want? There is suffering on the part of pretty much everybody who participated in this thing. It is an incident, as I said a minute ago, that is lost to time. But it is, in my opinion, well worth remembering, and we're going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. I'm also going to try and give you a little bit of background on some of the individuals who were involved, what happened to them, although in all honesty, there's not a lot of primary documents on this. Some of it, I'm going to have to use some conjecture. Now, as Darrell said, I have a bit of a background in something called special operations. And the thing about special ops is you may hear about the failures, such as the attempt to rescue the hostages in Iran. You will never hear about the successes unless it's something that the president decides is really worthy of a lot of publicity, like knocking off the guy in Afghanistan a while back. Yeah, you'll hear about those on rare occasions, but it's really rare. You're not going to hear about a lot of the successes because they're classified. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Let me give you some background chronology on this. April of 1865, the Civil War, or the war between the states, which is its proper term, or if you wish, the War of Northern Aggression, ends in April of 1865 with the capitulation of Lee and Johnston, commanding the armies of Northern Virginia and Tennessee, respectively. Reconstruction begins in the southern states. The Freedmen's Bureau is instituted, and part of the Freedmen's Bureau is the seizure of southern properties throughout the southern states by former plantation owners. And a lot of the people that are doing that seizing are former slaves working for the federal government. There's not a great deal of happy thoughts between those two factions. Martial law is imposed in the former Confederate states, particularly when they see the emergence of resistance efforts such as the Ku Klux Klan and the Black League, things of that nature. And lastly, some of you may have seen a movie a number of years back called Glory, about the 54th Massachusetts. The 54th Massachusetts was a regiment in what is commonly called the United States Colored Troops. That was their proper term. The USCT. The colored troops were disbanded. And in truth, with the exception of very rare situations like Glory, just outside Charleston, they didn't get a lot of credit for what they endured. In July of 1866, approximately a year later, Congress authorizes the establishment of black regiments, segregated regiments that the non-commissioned officers and the enlisted personnel are all black, all African Americans. The officers are all white. Primarily officers who were in the Civil War, some of whom are West Point graduates. And getting officers to volunteer for these regiments was actually very, very difficult, because this is a period of institutional racism throughout the culture of the United States. Those regiments were the 9th Cavalry, the 10th Cavalry, the 24th and 25th Infantry. All 4 of those regiments will be ordered into the South to reinforce the laws revolving around Reconstruction and the reestablishment of the southern states, the former Confederate states, into the Union. 1867 through 1876, the 9th Cavalry Regiment is assigned to border protection and stability duties along the Rio Grande River. So this is what that looks like, about the southern half of Texas. We're going to be talking about the area in tan here, beige, because that's where the main operations of the 9th Cavalry took place. However, the distance between the limits of where the regiment is supposed to be operating was approximately 1,300 miles. The 9th Cavalry Regiment consists of approximately 600 men at this point. They were not very big. They were spread extremely thin. You can see Brownsville, Ringgold Barracks, Fort McIntosh, Fort Duncan, Fort Clark. There were some other installations further up into the Big Bend area, but you know, about all you've got are some small troops, troops of 40 to 50 men, and you'll see a picture of one of those troops here in a bit. Drilling down a bit, what we're talking about is the 9th Cavalry. The regimental commander pulls his headquarters into Ringgold Barracks, just outside Rio Grande City in South Texas, right on the southern border, the border with Mexico. Right across from Rio Grande City is a Mexican city called Camargo. Right across from Brownsville and Fort Brown is a Mexican city called Matamoros in Monterrey. The distance between Rio Grande City and Brownsville is approximately 88 miles, depending on how you measure it. And the reason I say that is because the Rio Grande River at this time is running wide open. There are no dams along the length of it. So that riverbed shifts from time to time. So 88 is an approximation. Now let me back up. The coverage between Ringgold Barracks and Brownsville is covered by troops making a weekly patrol. There are some installations in McAllen and Edinburgh, about in here, but for the most part, that entire area is covered by soldiers on horseback. Specifically, in our case, we're talking about a detachment from G Troop, 9th Cavalry, that was assigned at Fort Ringgold. On the 26th of January of 1875, they leave Fort Ringgold early in the morning. Corporal Edward Troutman and 4 privates. This is an interesting group of men. All of them, with the exception of Private Blackstone, are first-term soldiers. They all enlist for a 5-year enlistment. There is no retirement. There is no medical care per se, other than a regimental surgeon, and things are pretty Spartan. This regiment is spread so thin. As a matter of fact, all the Army regiments that are committed to the Indian Wars are spread so thin they're always in the field. They are always in the field. And one of the things that I think we need to take into account is that if you go back and you look at the accounts of the Little Bighorn, and you look at the autopsies, and you look at some of the bodies that have been recovered even after the initial clearing of the battlefield. They've discovered that these men who were in the cavalry during this time period were in extremely poor physical condition. And the 7th Cavalry at Little Bighorn was one of the best equipped, one of the best fed, and they were actually in pretty good shape compared to somebody like the 9th Cavalry. The black units typically got the worst horses, they got the worst equipment. They there was one year where Congress completely forgot to pay them, and they ended up having to subsist based on food that they grew and raised for themselves, beef, vegetables, etc. Okay? The spines of these men were all debilitated to the point where today we would say they were 100% disabled. If they showed up in the VA and got spinal x-rays, you know, it would be, let me help you off the table, let me help you fill out your paperwork for your disability. These guys were in bad shape. Their teeth were worse. So Blackstone has served a previous term in the colored troops during the Civil War, and he has also served in the 10th Cavalry for a bit. But he gets out, and he's released from active duty because he's a troublemaker. He can't find a job. He gets back into the 9th Cavalry. Frederick we don't know a lot about Frederick. Although I'll pick that up in a couple more minutes. Owsley and Turner, we know nothing about them at all, other than what I will pick up for you here in just a couple of minutes. The patrol leaves Ringgold, as I said, early in the morning, and they get to Solis Ranch in the evening or late afternoon and set up a campfire, a small logger inn. And Solis Ranch at La Grulla is about a quarter of a mile from one of the major fords along the Rio Grande River. It is still a location for a major border crossing today. When they get there, another Frederick Remington picture of a campfire, and nothing really happens at first. However, about 6:30 in the evening, they hear a lot of noise coming from the ranch, which is relatively close by to the north, or to the south, sorry. About 10 minutes later, bullets start coming through the trees. Our sergeant here, or our corporal, mounts up, rides into the ranch house, and is confronted by a group of approximately 20 men who are looking at him very hard, and all of them are heavily armed. And he speaks a little bit of Spanish, and he proceeds to say, you know, we're here and we'd really appreciate it if you wouldn't shoot at us. We mean you no harm, so on and so forth. And all these guys look at him and say, si, senor, you know, no problem, etc. And our corporal goes on back to his men. He explains to his 4 privates what he's seen, tells them what's going on, and then he basically says, mount up, we've got to go now. They mount up, they get their gear together as quickly as they can, mount their horses. They're proceeding to move in the direction back to Fort Ringgold, which is about 17 miles, and it's the closest installation they can get to. They've made probably less than a quarter of a mile, is what I interpret the reports to say, when they're ambushed. Owsley and Turner were the two autopsies that I was looking for. Owsley is shot through the head, dies instantly. Turner takes one through the heart, same sort of thing. Blackstone and Frederick basically panic and just go into the brush, and they leave Troutman completely. Troutman, by contrast, now remember, this is a man who's a corporal in his first term. Black soldier, not normally held in very high esteem, but he's a corporal, which indicates to me that this man was seen as being a leader. Troutman takes time to dismount. He checks his two downed troopers, confirms that they're dead, mounts back up, and shoots his way out of the ambush. He is then pursued back to Fort Ringgold, the entire 17 miles, gets there at approximately midnight after doing escape and evasion all the way back. His other two troopers get in somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning. The following morning, the regimental commander, who's a highly esteemed officer named Hatch, rounds up the entire G Troop, which at this point is about 60 troopers, and goes back out to the ranch to find his two dead troopers. He's upset because the relationship between Hatch and his black cavalrymen was like this. They loved each other. The relationship of most of the white officers with their black NCOs and their black enlisted personnel, once they came to know them and came to understand them and believe in them, was also very, very tight. They go back out to the ranch, and they find, and this is what got my attention about this, they find both bodies have been stripped and they've been horribly mutilated. I won't tell you what the details are because that's in the autopsies as well. But that's a little unusual to find on a battlefield. Normally the bodies of the dead are not mutilated. Normally. It happens, but it's not normal. And that's what ultimately caught my attention. This search party arrests 8 people or 8 men and kill 1. Sorry, no, they arrest 9 and kill 1. In an outbuilding, they find the bloody uniforms and the equipment of the 2 dead troopers. They notice that through a window, and they end up having to break into this outbuilding to retrieve Army property. They find out later that the money that the 2 dead troopers had on them has been spent down in the city of Camargo that I mentioned a few minutes earlier. What then happens also got my attention, and that is Corporal Troutman, Private Blackstone, Private Frederick, Colonel Hatch, and the acting commander of G Troop, a Lieutenant French, were all arrested and indicted by the county sheriff and the judges in Starr County for burglary of that outbuilding where they found the uniforms. Months pass by and they're ultimately cleared, but in the process, Blackstone and Frederick have had to come up with money on their own for attorneys, and Frederick ends up killing Blackstone in an argument. Blackstone didn't want to pay Frederick back for money that had been loaned to him. Another piece of this puzzle that got my attention was that Frederick, having shot Blackstone, in the presence of 30 witnesses, is court-martialed. He's taken up to the department headquarters at Fort Wingate, New Mexico. He is tried by white officers from a separate regiment. He is found guilty. Now, this is 1876, 1875, 1876, right? What do you think's going to happen to Private Frederick during this period? What do you think is the penalty that will be assessed for Private Frederick? They're going to hang him, right? No. No. They give him a dishonorable discharge and walk him. He walks. The finding of the court, the sentence of the court, makes it all the way back to the department commander, who's a former Civil War II star, and his comment, which you can see in a letter, is, "I disagree with this finding, but I will support what the court wishes to do," which tells me that there's something going on here. You know, for a bunch of disinterested white officers on a court-martial to say to a black enlisted man, you know, this is a time period where blacks were not seen as being worth a whole heck of a lot, right? And they give him a dishonorable discharge and ban him from the post. That's it? When they were well within their rights to hang him. They could have done it, and they didn't. So, we come back to this drill down, and we're not done yet. What happens 3 months later is large groups of men cross the Rio Grande. They come together up at a place called Nueces Town, which is just to the southwest of Corpus Christi. There's about 250 of them. My personal belief is that that group that our corporal ran into might have been a recon element for what this is. And in any case, on 25 March 1875, the Nueces Town raid occurs. They gang rape the wife of one of the shop owners. They steal saddles. They steal food. They steal feed for horses, etc., etc., and then they start to beat it back to Mexico. The only problem with that is a lot of them forget that they're in Texas. And every Texan male is hot on their trail. There is some heavy retaliation coming, where they run into Mexican males riding horses that have a brand from, say, the King Ranch, or riding on a new saddle that was taken from somewhere. They just lynch him. Okay? There's over 100 men, 100 Mexican males who will be lynched during this process. You're looking at a picture of a guy named Juan Nepomuceno Cortina. Cortina is what is known in Mexico. Anybody here fluent in Spanish? No? Okay. Cortina is what is known in Latin America at the time as a caudillo, a leader, a warlord, essentially. He runs basically the area between Fort Ringgold, Rio Grande City, and in Brownsville, on both sides of the border, that 88 miles we were talking about. One of his underlings is kind of in charge at a ranch in Camargo. But this guy has been a thorn in the side of the United States government for the better part of 35 years. He is a former soldier in the Mexican army. He fought at Buena Vista. He is known to be an avowed enemy of the U.S. government, and he is constantly in the news as being a guy who instigates raiding parties across the border, moving north across the border to rustle cattle and to take cattle hides, because this is a period in which they have discovered how to refrigerate meat, and instead of driving them all the way back up to Dodge City or someplace like that, they can get meat back to the East Coast quickly, and the hides, the cattle hides, actually become more valuable than the meat itself. Kind of strange, but they're called the skinning wars. In any case, Cortina becomes a hunted man. Not by the U.S. Army. Not by the U.S. Army. The people that want him really, really bad are these guys. The state of Texas, the Governor Koch, institutes the Texas Rangers. In this case, a troop that is put together by a guy named Leander McNelly. He is a legend in Texas even today. He will lead a band of Rangers all the way south, back down to Solis Ranch, where this thing all starts, move across the border, and start and attack the ranch of Cortina's underling. In the process, he will kill this underling. He will kill approximately 60 people, 60 of this guy's cowboys, and bring back 150 head of stolen cattle. But he gets kind of hung up. For a while, it doesn't look as though things are going to go too well. And what, again, caught my attention is two troops from Fort Ringgold of the 9th Cavalry come out of Fort Ringgold, stage themselves right across the river from this battle going on down in Camargo, send a note across saying, "You need to come back immediately." Why send that note? Why send that note? Instead of just simply going across the border. The cavalry at the time on the U.S. side of the border are kind of restricted in what they can get away with because they're not allowed to take part in law enforcement operations. They're hindered by something called the Posse Comitatus Act. However, they can, when in hot pursuit, move across. Now, this force of the 9th Cavalry numbers in excess of 150 men. And they just sit there all day long, waiting for McNelly to come back across. They never do move across. They never move across the border. Now, we do know that there was some traffic, some message traffic going back and forth between McNelly and the Army commander to say, "I really don't need your help right now. Everything's going just fine. We got them on the run," so on and so forth. I was talking to you earlier about special operations. I personally think that's what this was. This is a reinforcement force, but it is also, in going after that one individual down in Camargo, this is a special operation similar to what you saw a couple of weeks ago in which the ISIS number one was taken down along with his executive officer. I personally think this is a special operation with credible denial because they've got a Texas Ranger force involved. You know, and it's just, we want to keep the Rangers out of trouble. Can I prove that? No, I cannot. I simply cannot. It's pure conjecture on my part, but I think the totality of the facts kind of bear it out. If you look at experience, So, if we look, sorry, let me back up. If we look at the area along the Texas border, along the New Mexico border, along the Arizona border, and California, movement back and forth across that border has been a problem for both the Mexican government and the U.S. government since the 1840s. It hasn't gone away. It's getting worse. It used to be Juan Cortina. Now it's drug cartels. And the drug cartels, the one up in the upper left-hand corner, Los Zetas, Cartel de Golfo is around Sonora. You've got Juarez. You've got Sinaloa. This is the one that bothers me. That's a logo for the Italian mafia. They're starting to branch out. I think what we've got down on the Mexican border now, or on the southern border of the United States, is not just a law enforcement problem. You've also got a problem that impacts national security. And I think it is, in some respects, crimes that are being perpetrated against humanity. And as we all know, last week, dual citizens of Mexico and the United States were murdered. Two mothers, their children, in a couple of different locations. So in the end here, what do we have? We have a very battered border. This is a picture of the border fence south of Tombstone, Arizona. It's about 10 years old now, but that's a very real thing, and it still exists in some places along the border. The Border Patrol, like the 9th Cavalry, and like the Customs and Enforcement agents down there, are stretched very, very thin. And I would argue that just adding more personnel, throwing more people at the problem isn't necessarily the answer. Neither is throwing more money at it. I think we've got to be a little bit more creative, but is this the answer? I don't know. I don't know. I think it might be part of the answer, but I think it's something that we need as a nation to really talk about. Since the 1800s, units of the military served honorably to try and protect the southern border of the United States. This is G Troop, 9th Cavalry, in 1876 at Fort Clark. Somewhere in that picture is brand new Sergeant Edward Troutman, who was meritoriously promoted for gallantry at Grulla, Texas. I would suggest to you that even though they were held in low esteem by many of the white regiments and by some of their own officers, but arguably not all, the record of the Buffalo Soldiers is one that those regiments can still be justly proud of. Just people like you and me, who agreed to wear the uniform of their country. This is the coat of arms of the 9th Cavalry. It is, like all coats of arms of a regiment, a small story of who that regiment is. If you look at the top, you can see the horseshoe, obviously, for a cavalry unit. You can see the crossed arrows for their service in the Indian Wars. The two blue wings represent their service during the Vietnam conflict as air cavalry, reconnaissance and surveillance troops. The lower portion of the shield, if you see the blue pennant, with the Spanish sun in the middle and the 3 stars represents their service in the Philippine conflict, the Spanish-American War. You can see the blockhouse there, which represents their service at San Juan Hill in Cuba, alongside their counterparts, the 10th Cavalry, and working in concert with a guy named Theodore Roosevelt. The yellow is representative of cavalry and armor. So there's a small story here of a very proud regiment that is still on active duty in the Army. It is currently assigned at Fort Riley, Kansas, and one of its squadrons is, I believe, in Iraq right now. So, are there any questions? I know this was fairly quick and we were all over the place, but I appreciate your attention. Are there any questions I can answer?